stream. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at Medtech Innovator. Welcome to Medtech Innovator Live. This is a weekly series that we run throughout our summer where we feature various experts on topics related to medical innovation. And this is part of the Medtech Innovator Accelerator. For those of you who have never seen any of these videos, Medtech Innovator is an accelerator, but we're a downstream accelerator. We are working with companies that are up and running, that have prototypes and evidence at least, many of whom are commercial in stage or certainly clinical in stage. So our job is to try and find these companies that are downstream and that have real promise and that the industry thinks will really make a difference in healthcare and make sure that they succeed. And so part of that is giving them really good advice. And that's what this series is about. We find topics that our cohort companies are interested in, and then we arrange to have experts on those topics. And you'll see this is not 101 style content. So for those of you who are looking for 101, that you might want to look somewhere else. But if you're looking for really, the nitty gritty about what's going on in our industry and things that might affect you directly, if you're, as I said, you're up and running as a company and not just thinking about starting a company, then you'll really enjoy this discussion. And this topic today is going to be like many that we do in our series. There are things that are going to directly affect the companies after they reach the market, certainly, but there are things that you should be thinking about now. And in the past, today's topic, which is going to be reimbursement, payers, and that landscape, is something that in the past, it was very common for people to say, oh, I don't have to think about that. That's later. That's someone else's problem. I just have to develop this medical device, get it approved by the FDA, and then those other people figure out this whole payment thing. But that's no longer the case, and we'll talk about why that is. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. I'll have each of them introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about yourself, the company you work for, and your role as it relates to reimbursement, among other things. So I'm going to start off and have, why don't we start with Pat? So Pat McGinnis, you want to just give us your background, and then we'll go to Steve.
You bet. Thanks, Paul, and hello, everyone. My name is Pat McGinnis. I'm a medical doctor. My training is that's in backs. My career.
Pat, we're having a little trouble with your audio. Sorry to interrupt. Maybe just make sure that mic is up. Sorry, I know your phone is.
Okay.
That's better.
Okay.
Nope, still having trouble. Maybe it's just the phone.
Okay.
Sorry, Pat. I'll let you fiddle with that for a second. Why don't I switch over to Steve and I'll let you check your audio. Steve, before you start, Steve, I'm just gonna just say quickly, Steve. I've had the pleasure of working with Steve and his partner David Kasich for many years at Medtech Innovator at their Medtech Strategist conferences. They're good friends of Medtech Innovator, and we're very lucky to have the ability to bring them on not only today, but to work with them throughout the years. So, Steve, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Paul, and it's always a pleasure to work with you and the Medtech Innovator team, and happy to be here with you and Pat on this webinar. So our company, Medtech Strategist, features publications and conferences that are exclusively dedicated to medtech. We don't do any pharma or biotech. And our flagship publication is Medtech Strategist, which focuses on the business side of the medtech industry. And then we also have a publication launched more recently called Market Pathways. And Market Pathways is probably more relevant to this webinar because it focuses solely on medtech regulatory, reimbursement, and policy issues. And then in addition to our publications, as Paul mentioned, we also do a couple of MedTech investor partnering conferences, one in Dublin, Ireland, the other in San Francisco. And proud to say that both of those conferences feature MedTech Innovator as an important part of the content of those conferences, which generally include both opportunities for small companies to make their pitches to investors in the audience, both venture capitalists and big company biz dev folks. And we also include speakers, plenary sessions, panels, fireside chats on topical issues. So even if a company may not be in a mode to raise money at a time, they'll still get something out of the conference. So that's who we are. And I just want to also say, if anybody has any interest in particular topics, I'm happy to make available and send to you copies of articles that may be relevant if you're interested in reimbursement or something. And our website is medtechstrategist.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. And Steve, also, I'm going to mention again for our audience that your publication is pretty unique. And I think you called yourselves dinosaurs at one point and said, we still believe people want to read long form. It's in the world we're living in today, a lot of publications just take press releases and they publish those or slightly modify them. They don't do a lot of work and they're very short stories. Your long form journalism, like your Market Pathways and MedTech Strategist publications, are truly, it's the main source for me when I go for news and for information, and I really want to understand a topic. Like I go to your publications, and I always have since.
Well, thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. We're still of the view that people will read more than 140 characters at a time. And as you say, we're not a news-driven publication. There are lots of other folks that do a great job at putting out kind of the daily news feeds, and we don't get in their lane, but we try to provide a more in-depth strategic view of industry issues with long-form journalism.
Great. Well, thank you for doing that. As I said, it keeps me informed, and that's the important thing. It's not just oh, this is what happened today, but this is important, thought-provoking discussion on a particular topic. So again, thank you for that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll get into more of that. I'm going to go back now and bring back Pat, and let's see if Pat. Let's see how your audio is this time.
Yeah. How's that sound now, Paul?
Way better. All right, Pat, your turn. Okay. Give us again your intro.
Great. Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Pat McGinnis. I'm a physician, background in internal medicine, aerospace medicine, and clinical informatics, and have had a varying career starting with NASA Johnson Space Center as a flight surgeon, then later moved on to the healthcare IT space, working with Cerner Corporation, and then as a director of medical informatics for Memorial Hermann Health System here in Houston. I then was with a telemedicine startup for a short time, and then landed a position with Humana Military. And I'll explain about Humana Military in a second. Parallel to all that, I also had a career in the Air National Guard and Air Force Reserves as a flight surgeon. So my role with Humana Military is as a medical director. Now, Humana Military, you can think of it as we are the administrator for the health insurance benefit for all members of the military, their families, and retirees. So it's a little bit different of an animal than commercial health insurance, which I can explain as needed during our session today. So as a medical director, probably my main role is looking at case reviews, then quality issues, and some business development that we've done with virtual care companies. Let me stop there, Paul, and see what's next.
Right. Very good. So let's do this. I want to start off first, since you already, you kind of teased at this, Pat. So why don't we start with just talking a little bit about the balance between clinical benefit and economic benefit, and how, Humana evaluates bringing in a new medical product. And let's just start there.
Sure. Yeah. Now, Humana is my parent company, just so everyone understands, and Humana Military only administers the healthcare benefit for those military members. So when we look at another company to partner with, it's first directed at the needs of our beneficiaries. And are we able to get them to the care and the providers that they need? So, we work with thousands and thousands of providers and healthcare facilities throughout basically the eastern half of the United States. And there's another managed care support contractor called HealthNet that works basically in the western half of the United States. So our main thing is, okay, can that company bring a clinical service to our beneficiaries? There are other partnerships we have that may be more like in the background technology, but the ones that I would deal with have to do with bread and butter medicine and things that our beneficiaries need as inpatients or outpatients, et cetera. How's that?
That's a great start. Thank you. And maybe just a little further clarification then. So you said clinical benefit is really the thing that you're focused on. Can it bring a benefit to your beneficiaries? So if a new technology, something that isn't widely available with many years of data behind it, pops up, is that something that Humana Military is going to sit back and wait and say, we want to wait for the data for some period of time? Like, what does it take, I guess, to get something in, and how aggressive is Humana Military in terms of looking at new innovative technology?
Well, funny you should ask, because I would say we were rather passive, because we have to operate within the boundaries or the guardrails of the Defense Health Agency. So the Defense Health Agency has a program called TRICARE. That's the name of this health benefit. So, and they have a policy which we adhere to called, TRICARE policy. So, but one thing that we all are familiar with is COVID, and COVID changed the landscape almost overnight. And then that kind of forced our hand to look at virtual care providers a little bit more aggressively, a lot more aggressively, in fact. So what we probably don't have as much flexibility on the Humana Military side as our parent company does, what I call Big Humana or Humana Incorporated, because, they deal with the commercial side and Medicare and employers, et cetera. So the good news is that, the cascading effect of COVID has made our part of the company more open to these conversations with startups, especially in the virtual care space.
Great. And thanks for clarifying that. So now, Steve, how about you? And you're looking at the landscape a little bit of a different way. And so, Steve, so when you're looking out and you're thinking of this benefit between the balance between clinical and economic benefits, what do you see in the market?
Well, let me start by going back to something you said, Paul, in your intro, which was, I think, right on target. And I think it's an important distinction for especially startup companies to understand. And credit to you for doing this program on reimbursement, because frankly, as you alluded to, if we were doing this 6, 8, 10 years ago, when I'm out talking to medtech CEOs, particularly of small to mid-sized companies, reimbursement, first of all, is a subject which makes even the most detail-oriented executives' eyes glaze over. But as you mentioned, at that point, it was very low on CEOs' priority lists. The typical line was, well, I don't have to worry about that. When I get acquired, that'll be something that the strategics will take care of, and I just have to worry about developing my product. And I have to say, the reason that I think that's important is that also was taking place at a time when regulatory issues were really the number one challenge facing medtech companies. If you go back a decade and you go back to Josh Mackauer's report, Josh Mackauer currently heading the Stanford Biodesign program, also at NEA, and he has Exploramed, his own incubator. He spearheaded a report with folks like AdvaMed and MDMA, the MedTech trade associations, to highlight the challenges that companies were facing in terms of how long it was taking to get products through FDA and to get them to market. And the reason that's critical is because that obviously slowed down innovation and prevented companies like MedTech innovator companies that are developing new innovative technologies from getting their products to market. The strategy was, well, you go to Europe first. That's where CE mark was easily obtained, get early commercialization data, raise some early revenue, and then you worry about the US later. And reimbursement was there, but again, it was well overshadowed by the regulatory issues. Now, and this is a whole other topic, but things at FDA have improved. I think that's a consensus among industry executives over the past decade. Not that it's perfect, but it increased transparency, more accountability, better relations between industry and the regulators. And as a result, I think reimbursement has now replaced regulatory as the number one topic and number one challenge facing medtech companies. So for medtech innovator companies, I don't think any longer you can ignore reimbursement, because it's not only your potential acquirers, but it's investors who now have reimbursement on their checklist. So when you go to raise money, they're going to ask you, well, you may not need to have your entire reimbursement strategy mapped out, but you better well have a pathway that you can explain to these investors how you're going to get your product paid for. So I think, again, reimbursement has really risen to the top of the priority list, and that's why I credit you for focusing on this, because it's no longer something that that can be ignored.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely on that. And it's something that now we counsel all of our companies. We have a whole value program specifically looking at payment and how you're going to get paid for your products, for exactly that reason during MedTech Innovators. So we want to make sure all of our companies have that knowledge and have the thinking early on to make the decisions they need to early that will affect their ability to get covered and reimbursed and paid and all those things down the road. Maybe
and if I can add just one other thing,
yeah.
which is that when you think about reimbursement, it's a much more complex landscape than regulatory. And I'm not in any way saying that dealing with the FDA is easy, but think of it this way. When you're looking to get your product through FDA, you're really focused on one agency. When you're talking about reimbursement, and Paul, you alluded this in your intro, you're talking about coding, coverage, and payment. You're talking about not only CMS, when you're talking about Medicare and Medicaid, you're talking about the MACs. And I apologize in advance because reimbursement is just rife with acronyms. And so we'll try to explain them as we use them, but apologies if we fall into acronym speak. But MACs, the Medicare Administrative Contractors, who are the regional organizations that handle the Medicare program in the various regions, most of them are also private insurers. So then you have the private insurers themselves. And then when you get into the coding area, the CPT coding area is run by the AMA. So there's just a morass of different organizations and complexities. And so again, I like to think of it as a multifactorial process as compared with the FDA and regulatory. And I think that's very important for companies to recognize.
Yeah, no, good point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Pat in here too, Pat, for part of this as well. So as you know, we just got that little brief intro to coding, coverage, and payment. As it relates to Humana Military, how does that affect you? Is coding, coverage, and payment important to you, or do you operate in a different way?
Oh, no, it's very important to us. But as Steve mentioned, it makes your eyes glaze over. Luckily for me personally, I mostly stay in the clinical evaluation lane of, this request for this medical condition or this surgical condition. But absolutely, we have a whole team of people that manage the coding and the reimbursement issues. And yeah, we track those kind of metrics just as any other health insurer would do as well. Very rarely does a reimbursement issue come to me. Sometimes it comes in the form of a question related to durable medical equipment. And if this particular request meets, first of all, is it medically necessary for a particular patient and their condition? And then secondly, sometimes as we go through the cases, we are aware of how much does something actually cost, and then what would be the reimbursement level. So you mentioned CMS. I mean, TRICARE and the Defense Health Agency is its own independent agency, but certainly CMS is kind of out ahead of things with regard to overall policy and reimbursement issues. So no doubt in my mind that policies that we follow often are led by the CMS, and then people that create the TRICARE policy and the Defense Health Agency would be keeping abreast of those developments too.
And, Paul, if I can get back to your question from this angle, which is because I think it's oftentimes helpful to compare and contrast reimbursement with regulatory, because companies have a feel for the regulatory process. And one of the big challenges that medtech innovator companies are going to face is just the fact that, particularly I think on the private side, but also true with CMS, it's just a very, very opaque process. I would compare it to where FDA was a decade ago, and I came by my gray hair, honestly. So I lived through that, and it was very difficult to get information out of the agency. It was hard to exchange data, and it wasn't really very transparent or open. And I think I credit Jeff Shern, who runs the device branch, CDRH at FDA, with really opening things up. And I think things have gotten a lot better. CMS, I think, remains largely a black hole, and they're a public agency. So when you look at the private insurers, and again, when you're talking about the MACs, you've got that kind of two-headed monster. They've got a public and a private responsibility there. They are even harder to get information out of. So I go back to your question about, how do companies, go about getting their new technologies adopted by these payers. And it's really just a source of great challenge, because the private companies don't want to and don't see themselves as having, a necessarily obligation to open things up. And CMS, frankly, somewhat sympathetic, because CMS is so understaffed that it's, and again, not an excuse for them not being more open. But they are, again, where FDA was a decade or so ago. And so it's really difficult from a company perspective to get the kind of information that ideally you would like to get from both the private and the public payers.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to have that context, Steve. As you said, there's a lot of opaqueness going on. Is that changing? Are those things getting better? You said this is where FDA was 10 years ago. What are you observing, Steve, and Pat? You can comment too after that. Anything you're
Well, I
observing?
think there have been steps in the right direction, and I'd point to something, particularly the breakthrough device program, and where you're starting to see some level of coordination between FDA and CMS. And again, I don't want to go too far here. There's for decades there's been talk about, could we eventually evolve to some kind of parallel review process that takes into account both FDA approval and CMS, but we're nowhere near that, and who knows if we'll ever get there. But Breakthrough has been a very successful program, and I would encourage any medtech innovator companies whose technologies would fit the criteria for Breakthrough to pursue that. And the numbers on Breakthrough devices have really skyrocketed. So this is a program that is not just being adopted in name only. Both agencies are working through this. And again, the connection is, if you get breakthrough status, you can get coverage for certain, and there's criteria that you have to meet, but CMS will qualify you under Medicare. So it's really a worthwhile program for companies that, now again, it's not for every product. It's for truly innovative devices that meet those specific needs. But I'd point to that as an example of the fact that there is progress being made.
Yeah. And let me just ask one more thing related to that, Pat, and then I'll have you comment if you'd like to. So, but there was the MCIT, which was what was going to provide the coverage for breakthrough devices, and that was repealed. So now there's TCIT on the agenda. What is TCIT? Can you explain that real quick?
Sure. Well, you said real quick. That's difficult, but I'll try. I'll give you an elevator pitch version of. So you had MCIT, which was another one of those nasty acronyms: Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, MCIT, and it actually popped up on a lot of people's radar screens relatively recently, but it dates back to the Obama administration, which is when it was developed, and then it kind of languished for a while. And then right before President Trump left office, he pushed it over to CMS in an executive order, which surprised a lot of people. But I'll spare you the details, but the executive order lacked a lot of the criteria that were necessary in most industry people's minds to make this an effective program. Things like collecting information on device safety and effectiveness. So as a result, it was, as you said, it was repealed. But the idea of the program, the idea to have some kind of expedited review for innovative technologies, is an idea that is one of the few things in Washington these days that you can actually get bipartisan support for. So while MCIT was repealed, the idea for this kind of program is still alive. And the next version that is kicking around is referred to as TCET, and TCET is TCET. Again, apologies for another acronym, but the idea, again, that there will be a expedited program where innovative technologies can get faster approval, but along with that will come the requirement that there's certain clinical data that's collected for a certain period of time during which that device will have Medicare coverage. And then at the end of that 4-year period, then they'll make an assessment. Well, is this something that we should continue to cover or not? So TCET doesn't currently exist now in any specific legislative format. It's still in the ideation stage, I guess you'd say. But there does seem to be support both at CMS and in Congress to eventually come up with some type of program that has the safeguards in it that the MSIT program lacked. I hope I didn't get too far into the weeds on that.
No, that was just fine. Thank you. You did a good job on the quickly version of explaining. So thank you. Without us getting any more into the weeds on TSIT at the moment, Pat, going back to Humana Military. First of all, how big a population are we talking about in terms of a customer base?
Well, I don't know if that's a proprietary number or not. So let's just say it's in the millions of
millions.
People who are, active duty military, reserve military, their families, and retirees up to the age of 65 when they switch over to Medicare. So it is substantial.
Substantial. Yeah.
And I'll stay away from the CMS type questions like Steve was answering, because that's way out of my lane. But internally we have things to allow us to be more innovative, and I can touch on those for a couple of minutes if you'd like, Paul.
Yeah, I would. That's where I was going to go, is like, how do you make your decisions? So yes, please talk about a little bit about that in terms of innovation.
Yeah. So the one place where policy, the TRICARE policy gives us more latitude is rare diseases. And there are criteria, and I don't know them off the top of my head, of what qualifies as a rare disease, but we have more latitude with approving and reimbursing for medications, and I assume other technology that would be requested under that. Secondly, as a spin-off from COVID, both we as the managed care support contractor and our partners at the DHA do recognize that we both have to be a little bit more agile with adopting innovative companies. So with the two main companies of virtual care that we are now partners with are Doctor on Demand and also Telemind. Telemind is a behavioral health virtual care provider. But there are several other virtual care providers out there in the market, and some have approached us to also be partners and become part of our provider network. I can't mention any names of companies, but physical therapy is one where companies have figured out, okay, how can we do this, take it from the brick and mortar network to the virtual network where a patient can stay at home or have the sessions in the office that are very convenient for them and have equivalent outcomes to a brick and mortar in-person session. So we're looking at companies that bring that value proposition to us. And then the last thing I'll touch on, we've actually started up. It's not quite an internal incubator to the scale of MedTech Innovator, but we do have a group of which I'm a member internally. We call it Rev Lab, and that's a group that is to consider, okay, how can we rapidly or reiterate different ideas, different partnerships, different pilot programs. So that is something that's just getting root, and I think to be seen of how it will blossom.
If I can just add something to what Pat said, because I think you really hit on an important topic, and that is the whole digital health space, digital health, telehealth, whatever, it's got a lot of different labels. It presents a whole new set of challenges for regulators and for the reimbursement folks over at CMS. There's a fascinating report that I'd encourage, if companies are involved in the digital space, they may want to take a look at. I had mentioned the Josh Mackauer report from 2010. Well, the UCLA Biodesign Group, together with Boston Consulting Group, did a report focusing, kind of updating the regulatory side, but focusing on digital health also. And the whole challenges of things like software as a service and the various ways that digital technologies get incorporated in traditional medical, the whole sensor world, is just something which presents a lot of challenges for reimbursement folks at CMS. And as we know, historically, regulators have lagged behind innovators when it comes to new technologies, both in terms of getting them approved or cleared by FDA and getting reimbursed at CMS. So it's very interesting looking at digital health. And I think CMS deserves credit, same with FDA, for taking steps. They've created offices that are focused exclusively on the digital health world, but there's still a long way to go. And again, as we all know, this whole digital/telehealth space is just evolving so rapidly that it really presents reimbursement challenges. And it's something that if you're a company, a startup company with MedTech Innovator, and you have a digital component to your technology, it's something that you really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, agreed. And it's been great seeing how the innovation around telehealth has really opened up a lot of doors for people that, as Pat mentioned earlier, that, just those doors weren't open. Now, all of a sudden they're open. And a lot of companies are thriving in many cases that almost went out of business prior to COVID, and were languishing, and all of a sudden they've got these these thriving businesses. So Pat, I want to go back to you just so it's clear to everybody, because you said this new RevLab is a new thing. Is if somebody has a product, and whether it's telehealth or not, and they want to get into Humana Military as an opportunity, just explain kind of what that path is like, who they contact, what that pathway is like. I know you're involved in many of these, but just to give us kind of that overview of what the process is like, the evaluation, and just so anyone who's out there listening can understand, because as I was alluding to, and you were saying, it is a large population, and a great place to go for an innovative company. So explain to us how somebody would do that. Where do they start? What's the process like?
Well, for your audience, I think we're going to share my email later, so they can contact me. And for my part, it's really, again, I probably said it too many times, it's more focused on those clinical services of I mentioned physical therapy a minute ago. Those are things that our beneficiaries need. It's helpful to the beneficiary and convenient to the beneficiary to start using these digital tools. So, and Steve kind of alluded to it before, there are certain things we have to do. If you're a virtual provider, well, you still have to have your medical license. You still have to go through a credentialing process. We still have internal procedures where we say, okay, Dr. Jones is, in fact, an ENT surgeon in Peoria, Illinois. So, those things don't go away just because you're virtual. And, there are some rules about where the providers versus where the patients are located for virtual care, and they may vary from state to state. And even the laws can vary from state to state. So what we do first for my end is say, okay, is this technology or is this service something that is necessary and needed for our patient population? And then is it equivalent to or better than clinically from a brick and mortar service? And then from there, it wouldn't be under my domain, but other colleagues in the company to say, okay, how do we integrate that company into our overall provider network? It's not, we know how to do it now since we've done it a couple of times with COVID, but it's not just to turn the switch and you're in. We have certain processes and certification gates that we must go through to ensure we maintain high clinical quality for all of our beneficiaries.
Do you run pilots like other health institutions might?
We haven't really run pilots. We've started kind of a crawl, walk, run phase once someone is part of our provider network.
Got it. Okay. And is it just so everyone, I guess we get the understanding. You mentioned before, I can't remember if you said hundreds or thousands of providers and locations. So is that something where kind of in that crawl, walk, run model where like it's tested, you do a crawl in just a couple of locations or something, and then it's available across all providers, or how does it in terms of that benefit?
It would be available to all the beneficiaries. We're not quite in the business of providing technology to individual providers. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I meant more like they're authorized to deliver that technology, or once it's been crawled somewhere, I guess is the point. Piloted, yeah.
Yeah, and we'd have to connect the dots. Like, okay, there's what they call pre-authorization. So some things have to go through pre-authorization. Many things are just automatically approved. But okay, if it's one of these clinical conditions or procedures or services that require insurance pre-authorization, okay, we have to connect those technology dots, if you will, not just with a brick and mortar provider, but now with this virtual healthcare company. And then we also have to say, all right, do we have means to get those consultant reports, if you will, back to the primary care provider or back to the military medical treatment facility? So that's why I say it's a technology question of putting our procedures, adapting them to the virtual world as well.
Okay. Thank you for the clarifications on that. So I'm going to go back here to Steve as well. So Steve, when we we talk to companies all the time, as I mentioned in the intro, we're trying to help people avoid mistakes. We're trying to save people time. And I know you're interviewing lots of CEOs. You're talking to, I presume, some of the agencies, CMS, and other payers as well in your process of looking at the overall landscape. So, what are some things that you would give people as advice, Steve, having done that, other than kind of at a high level saying reimbursement's important, you need to be thinking about it. What more tactically are you hearing? Are you seeing? What do you think people should be doing? What are the big boys doing that the smaller companies should be thinking about? Any advice, any just kind of tips you can give, Steve?
I think that's a great question, Paul. And I think going back to what we talked about earlier, where we said now it's really critical for early stage companies to incorporate reimbursement into their overall strategic plans at an early stage. The question that I think goes along with that is, what kind of expertise do you have as an early stage company in the reimbursement space? Because as this conversation today illustrates, you get into the weeds very, very quickly, and you quickly find out, there's a lot that you don't know. And again, the skill sets that people have, whether they be R&D, whether in engineering, whether they be finance, don't necessarily carry over to reimbursement. So the question that I think companies need to consider early on is, how are you going to address this? Now, companies that I've talked to do it a number of different ways. Obviously, they're the use of consultants. And the other thing with reimbursement, going back to what we said before, it's a multifactorial process. So you might have a consultant who is an expert on the coding process and knows the ins and outs of working with the AMA on the CPT process. but doesn't really know about the coverage or the payment side of things. That's a whole other knowledge set in terms of working with CMS and the private payers. So companies need to decide, well, how are you going to manage this? So for startups, you can look at just retaining one or two outside consultants, but at some point, just like any strategic element in within the company, you're going to need somebody in-house who can manage that process and who is knowledgeable and at least enough about it to be able to say, okay, this is what we want to do. So I think the decision of when do you bring a reimbursement expert in-house is now gotten to be one of those early hiring decisions. I've had companies tell me it's even more important to do that before you bring on a sales and marketing person, because again, you're going to have to implement that kind of reimbursement strategy perhaps at an earlier stage than you're going to need to develop a commercialization strategy. So I think that's a critical element. And then along with that is that reimbursement can't be looked at as a separate silo. The companies that I've found that have run into problems have really kind of siloed reimbursement because, again, it's easy to, like we said, it's not the most exciting of topics, and it's easy to just like push it off to the side. But the successful companies have been able to integrate reimbursement with their overall strategic plan. So, for example, I had one company who told me a story how the Medicare reduced the reimbursement on their product, and the company was going to go ahead with it, but the reimbursement person who was in-house was able to prevail on the CEO to say, no, you want to include reimbursement in your pricing decisions, and it would have been a mistake for them to lower their price just because Medicare happened to lower their price. So I just use that as an example of how companies really need to make sure reimbursement is coordinated with the entire strategic vision of the company from an early stage.
So it's a really good way of thinking of it. I think that that there's the decisions about pricing, you can't just tie directly into what you're hearing from one payment agency,
Right.
so that's definitely a thing. I mean, we've seen the impacts of decisions like the famous one with the cardiac rhythm monitoring with iRhythm
Right.
and others just getting destroyed by some of the changes in coverage. Is that something that you look at, Steve, in kind of the landscape? And if you do, what are some of the other kind of gotchas that are out there that maybe have besides that one, which was well publicized? Are there any of the ones that you can think about that kind of have been newsworthy or been things that people are thinking about?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the best way that I would describe this is that reimbursement is not a one-size-fits-all process. And I would be very wary of anyone who says, because let me put it this way, there are lots of what I call kind of reimbursement urban myths that are out there. And some of those are, well, it's always better to get a national coverage decision. And when I say a national, again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but a national coverage decision is the decision issued by CMS that says basically they will pay X price, they'll reimburse for this product in all of the regions of the US. But the reality is when you talk to companies, what people may not know about national coverage decisions is those decisions often carve out certain limitations on your technology. So they will cover, let's say, 50% of the applications that you as a company potentially want to use, but they'll only pay for half of those. So it's national, yes, and it's something that you can avoid. I was referring to the MACs before. It clearly is a shorter process to go through CMS. I'm not saying it's short, but it's shorter than to go out and pursue each of the MACs that are out there. but the result may be worse for you with a national coverage decision than if you went to the max, you took the time to get approved there, because what happens often, not always, is that once one or two max make a decision, then there's kind of a follow the leader effect, and oftentimes the other max will fall into place. So you may end up getting greater coverage, might take you a little longer, but you actually may get greater coverage by pursuing a strategy that goes after the Medicare administrative contractors rather than pursuing a national coverage decision. And like I said, common wisdom, I think, among people who may not be as informed is that, oh, well, you always want to go to a national coverage decision. And that's simply not the case. So again, it's kind of like the old peeling back the onion. In reimbursement, every company is going to have their own situations. For example, another situation is when you submit your IDE, companies are either categorized as category A, which are experimental, or category B. And if you're category A, you are not eligible for reimbursement for that experimental product. But if you're a category B product, you can get your products reimbursed, for example, during your clinical trials, which may be a good idea. But again, I can tell you, I've spoken to a couple of companies that ended up going with category B, thinking, of course, it's going to be better if we get paid for these devices. But what they found was that the hoops that they had to jump through and the obstacles that they faced to try to get reimbursement were so difficult that they ended up changing their clinical trial design. And they basically said, it's just not worth it. It will get our product to market faster by just biting the bullet. And their board didn't like it, but they went along with it, and they just paid for the devices that were used in the trial, and it worked out much quicker for them. So I just use those as a couple of examples of these kind of urban myths that are out there, like it's always better to do X. Well, it may not always be better for your particular company and your technology.
Wish I'd started off by asking you to talk about urban legends, because more time to get into more of those. I may come back to that in a second. Pat, let me switch back to you. We only have 5 minutes in the YouTube portion of this, so I want to make sure that that you have a chance to give us kind of a wrap up on what, again, how people enter the Humana military universe if they're interested. What is where do they start? And again, I know you're going to give your email address to our cohort companies, but for the people out there on YouTube who are just watching, what's their process? And any advice, if there's an urban myth you want to dispel or anything, you can help us do that.
Boy, actually, I am not sure the entry process, other than the personal connection with an email to me or one of my colleagues within Humana Military. The other entryway, if you will, is if they are working with our parent company. As I mentioned earlier, Humana Inc. has more flexibility than we do. In fact, Humana Inc. had already been working, for example, with Doctor on Demand before we adopted them over onto the military side. I will, in a couple of minutes, touch on some interest areas for us.
Great.
Virtual health providers. If you've got a better way to skin that cat, I mentioned physical therapy. I know there are also nutritional therapy companies out there. We're open to adding virtual providers to our network. Maternal health is a theme very interested, or the Defense Health Agency is very interested in improving maternal health, and also behavioral health. We've seen a spike in behavioral health use since COVID, and that continues. Secondly, you mentioned pilot projects. I think in the future there will be opportunities for those kind of demonstration projects, and centers of excellence is a theme which has come up a couple of times with our Defense Health Agency partners. That might be an area. Now we think of I'll go to a certain hospital in Houston or a certain health system in Minnesota as a center of excellence. But, could those be virtual at some point? Could you get those consultations done quickly and virtually when you need that kind of help? And can we bring that service to our members of the military? So those are, disease management, those sorts of things, centers of excellence, those sorts of things, and the virtual healthcare providers being added to our network would be some themes for your cohort companies.
Great, thank you for that. And then as far as you mentioned, as you said, you're reaching out to you directly. Are you on LinkedIn? Can people find you that way?
I am on LinkedIn. Yes, sir.
All right. So for people out there, if you want to find Pat, you can probably find him on LinkedIn. And Steve, your publication, you offered at the outset that, so Market Pathways and Medtech Strategist are both paid publications,
Right.
Not just free ad-supported stuff. They're paid publications, but you did offer, if some people are interested in some of those articles, you can make them available. How should people find you, Steve?
Absolutely. And again, we've had articles on a lot of the topics that we've talked about today. So if you're interested in MSIT or TSET, if you're interested in either the MACAR report, the UCLA report, I mean, we've kind of touched on that and a lot of other reimbursement issues, and happy to provide, individual articles to people. Just email me at S like Steve .Levin, Lev like Victor, IN like Nancy, at medtechstrategist.com, s.levin at medtechstrategist.com. And I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both for being here for the discussion today. As I said at the outset, we weren't going to get into too much of the nitty gritty, not too much of the, very specific stuff on, how to obtain certain codes and all that. That's another discussion we'll have at another time. But this is good to kind of lay out just the general, some of the general things that are happening in the ecosystem, and beyond just what we think of as the traditional private payers. There's other avenues, there's other populations that are really interesting to look at. In this case, Humana Military being a very sizable one. So thanks, Pat, for taking the time to demystify some things for us there. And for anyone out there in the YouTube audience, I thank our panelists. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Steve. And we're going to wrap up the live stream. And for all of you who are here in the MedTech Innovator cohort, stick around for the private Q&A. For those of you on the live stream, you can go to medtechinnovator.org/live for a full list of all of our webinars, for background, speaker bios, and all sorts of things, upcoming schedules. And we'd love to have you join us for some of the other ones that are coming up, or you can watch the archives as well. So medtechinnovator.org/live for that. So for those of you on YouTube, have a great